The freezing water of the Hudson River felt like 1,000 tiny needles stabbing Sage Mitchell's body as she jumped in without stopping to think. The little boy's scared cries had cut through the busy morning sounds of Manhattan like a knife cutting through soft cloth. She didn't think about her wet coffee shop uniform, her phone in her pocket, or the fact that she couldn't afford to miss another day of work. All she saw were those tiny hands going under the dark water. Her lungs hurt as she fought against the moving water, her arms cutting through the dirty river with strength that came from pure instinct. When her fingers finally grabbed onto the small, shaking body, she felt relief so strong it almost made tears come to her eyes. The boy couldn't have been older than 5 years old, his dark hair stuck to his head, his lips blue from the cold. "I've got you," she whispered against his ear as she pulled him to the side of the river, her voice barely heard over his scared crying. "You're safe now." What Sage didn't know, as she did CPR on the riverbank while worried strangers called 911, was that she had just saved the most protected child in New York City. She had no idea that within an hour every security camera within 10 blocks would be checked, every witness questioned, every detail of her life looked at closely by men in expensive suits who worked for only one person. She had no idea that Antonio, Tony Ricci, the most feared man in the city, was about to turn her world upside down. If you want to discover how this story began and what happened after this life-changing moment, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment about where you're watching from. Every view helps bring more stories like this one to life. Sage Mitchell's alarm clock screamed at 4:30 in the morning just like it had every morning for the past 3 years. She rolled out of her narrow bed in the studio apartment she shared with her elderly neighbor's cat, her body fighting every movement. 2 jobs, night classes, and exactly 4 hours of sleep had become her normal routine. The coffee shop where she worked as the opening barista sat in the heart of Manhattan's financial district, a tiny place of warmth in a world of steel and glass. By 5:45 in the morning, she was already grinding beans and getting ready for the morning rush of people in suits and ties who barely noticed her. "Morning, Sage," called Marcus, the shop owner, as he arrived with the day's pastries. "You look tired, kid." "I'm fine," she replied automatically, tying her apron with practice speed. It was her standard response to everything. Bills piling up? Fine. Eviction notice? Fine. Eating ramen for the 5th day straight? Absolutely fine. The morning rush began like clockwork at 6:30 in the morning. Sage moved with smooth skill, her hands creating perfect designs in lattes, while her mind wandered to her evening classes. She was 3 semesters away from finishing her social work degree. 3 semesters away from maybe finally having a life that didn't center around survival. It was 8:15 in the morning when she heard the screaming. Sage looked up from the espresso machine to see a crowd gathering outside the shop's large windows. People were pointing toward the river, their faces twisted with panic. Without thinking, she untied her apron and rushed outside. The scene unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. A small boy had somehow fallen from the riverside walkway into the Hudson River. The current was strong, pulling him away from the side, and his small voice was barely heard over the city noise. "Someone call 911, a woman shouted. "Where are his parents?" Another voice demanded, but no one was moving. Everyone stood frozen, watching helplessly as the child struggled against the water. Sage didn't remember making the decision to run. Her legs simply carried her toward the river's edge, her sneakers pounding against the concrete. She heard someone yell, "Don't!" behind her, but the voice seemed to come from another world. The water was shockingly cold, taking away her breath and making her muscles freeze up. But she pushed forward, her eyes locked on the boy's terrified face. Swimming had been her escape as a child, the one activity that made her feel powerful when everything else in her life felt crazy. When she reached him, the boy was barely awake, his small body limp with tiredness and cold. She wrapped her arms around him and began the difficult swim back to shore, fighting against the current with every stroke. "Stay with me," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to him or herself. By the time they reached the riverbank, a crowd had gathered. Sage pulled the boy onto the concrete and immediately began CPR, her training from a long-ago lifeguard class kicking in automatically. Water poured from his lungs as he coughed and sputtered back to consciousness. "Mama," he whispered in a small, scared voice. "She's coming," Sage lied gently, wrapping him in someone's offered jacket. "You're going to be okay." The ambulance arrived within minutes, paramedics taking over with professional skill. As they loaded the boy onto a stretcher, he reached out a small hand toward Sage. "Thank you," he said in accented English, his dark eyes wide and serious. Sage squeezed his fingers gently. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Marco," he whispered. "Marco Ricci." The name meant nothing to her, but she noticed how several people in the crowd looked at each other. She noticed how quickly the paramedics worked, how many police officers suddenly appeared, how someone with an expensive camera was taking pictures of everything. "Miss, we need to get your information," a police officer said, walking up with a notepad. Sage gave her details automatically, still dripping wet and shivering. Her phone was destroyed, her uniform ruined, and she was definitely going to be late for her afternoon job at the diner. But none of that mattered. The boy was alive. As the ambulance pulled away, she started walking back toward the coffee shop, water squishing in her shoes. That's when she saw him. A man stood beside a black SUV across the street, his presence demanding attention even in the chaos. He was tall, probably in his late 30s, with dark hair and the kind of sharp features that belonged in magazines. His suit probably cost more than Sage made in 6 months. And when their eyes met across the distance, she felt something electric pass between them. He was staring at her with a strength that made her breath catch. Not the casual interest of someone watching, but something deeper, more personal, like he was memorizing every detail of her face. Then someone walked up to him, another man in an expensive suit, and whispered something in his ear. The stranger's expression changed, his jaw tightening as he listened. He looked at Sage one more time, his dark eyes unreadable, before getting into the SUV. As the vehicle pulled away, Sage noticed something that made her stomach flip. The license plate was completely black with no visible numbers or letters. "Who was that?" she asked a nearby police officer. The officer followed her gaze, but the SUV was already disappearing into traffic. "Who was who, miss?" Sage shook her head, suddenly feeling foolish. "Never mind." But as she walked back to work, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't yet understand. The man's face was burned into her memory, and something told her this wouldn't be the last time she saw those dark, intense eyes. What she didn't know was that at that very moment, Antonio Ricci was making a phone call that would set everything in motion. "Find out everything about her," he said quietly into his phone, his voice carrying the kind of power that made grown men shake. "Everything." 3 days later, Sage was still finding river water in unexpected places. Her hair smelled faintly of the Hudson despite multiple washings, and her phone was permanently dead. She'd been forced to use her emergency credit card for a replacement, adding another debt to her growing pile. The coffee shop had been busier than usual, with customers asking about the hero barista who'd saved the drowning child. The story had made local news, though thankfully without her full name or photo. The last thing she needed was attention she couldn't afford. "You're famous," Marcus teased as she prepared for the morning rush. Channel 7 called asking for an interview. "Absolutely not," Sage replied firmly. "I just did what anyone would do." "Not anyone would jump into the Hudson River," Marcus pointed out. "That was brave, kid." "Stupid maybe, but brave." Sage was about to respond when the bell above the door rang. She looked up to see a man in an expensive suit walking up to the counter. He was handsome in a quiet way, with kind eyes and a gentle smile that immediately put her at ease. "Good morning," he said warmly. "I'd like a large coffee, black, and," he paused, studying the menu, "what would you recommend for someone who's never been here before?" "The lavender honey latte is popular," Sage offered. "Or if you prefer something simpler, our house blend is really good." "I'll trust your judgment," he said with a smile. "Lavender honey latte it is." As Sage prepared his drink, she noticed he was watching her with real interest, not the dismissive glances she usually received from customers wearing suits. "I'm David, by the way," he said when she handed him the cup. "David Chin." "Sage," she replied automatically, then immediately wished she hadn't given her real name to a stranger. Beautiful name, David said. Listen, I know this might sound forward, but would you like to have dinner sometime? There's this great little Italian place in Little Italy that I think you'd love. Sage blinked in surprise. It had been months since anyone had asked her out, and even longer since she'd had time to say yes. That's really nice of you, but I work most evenings. What about Sunday? Everyone deserves one day off. Before Sage could respond, the bell rang again. This time, the man who entered made the entire coffee shop fall silent. He was the same man she'd seen across the street 3 days ago, but up close, his presence was even more overwhelming. Antonio Ricci moved through the space like he owned it, his dark eyes scanning the room before settling on Sage. He was even more handsome than she remembered, with the kind of dangerous attractiveness that made smart women make stupid decisions. "Excuse me," David said politely, stepping aside as Antonio walked up to the counter. "Espresso," Antonio said simply, his voice low and commanding. "Double shot." Sage's hands shook slightly as she prepared his drink. She could feel him watching her every movement, and the strength of his attention made her skin feel warm despite the morning chill. "You're the one who saved the boy," he said. It wasn't a question. "I just did what anyone would do," Sage replied, repeating her earlier words to Marcus. "No," Antonio said firmly. "Not anyone would risk their life for a stranger's child." Their eyes met as she handed him the cup, and Sage felt that same electric connection she'd experienced by the river. His fingers brushed hers as he took the espresso, and she noticed his hands were surprisingly gentle despite their obvious strength. "How is he?" she asked. "Marco. Is he okay?" Something shifted in Antonio's expression at the mention of the boy's name. "He's fine. Thanks to you." "I'm glad," Sage said sincerely. "He seemed like a sweet kid." Antonio studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You have no idea who I am, do you?" "Should I?" Sage asked, confused by the question. Before Antonio could respond, David cleared his throat. "Sorry to interrupt, but Sage, you never answered my question about dinner." The temperature in the coffee shop seemed to drop 10 degrees. Antonio's attention shifted to David, and Sage noticed how the other man immediately straightened, some basic instinct recognizing danger. "You're asking her out," Antonio observed, his voice perfectly calm. "Yes," David replied, though his confidence was clearly fading. "Is that a problem?" Antonio took a slow sip of his espresso, never breaking eye contact with David. "That depends." "On what?" David asked. "On whether you can protect her." The words hung in the air like a threat. Sage looked between the two men, confusion and anger building in her chest. "Excuse me," she said firmly, "but I don't need anyone's protection, and I certainly don't need permission to go to dinner with someone." Antonio's gaze returned to her, and she saw something like approval flicker in his dark eyes. "You're right. You don't need permission." He finished his espresso in one swallow and placed exact change on the counter. "But you do need protection whether you realize it or not." "What's that supposed to mean?" Sage demanded. Instead of answering, Antonio reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. He placed it on the counter next to the money, his fingers staying for just a moment. "When you're ready to understand what happened 3 days ago," he said quietly, "call me." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "And Sage, be careful who you trust." After he left, the coffee shop slowly returned to its normal volume. David was still standing at the counter, looking shaken. "Who the hell was that?" he asked. Sage picked up the business card with shaking fingers. It was simple, elegant, with just a name and phone number pressed in gold. "Antonio Ricci." "I have no idea," she whispered. But even as she said it, she knew she was lying to herself. Deep down, some instinct was screaming that Antonio Ricci was dangerous in ways she couldn't begin to understand. And despite every rational thought in her head, she found herself slipping the card into her pocket. "So," David said, his voice slightly strained, "about that dinner." Sage looked at him, kind, safe, normal David, and tried to feel excited about his invitation, but all she could think about were dark eyes and the way Antonio had said her name like it was something precious. "Can I think about it?" she asked. David nodded, though disappointment was clear on his face. "Of course. You know where to find me." After he left, Sage found herself staring at the door, her mind racing. What had Antonio meant about protection? What had happened 3 days ago that she needed to understand? And why did every instinct in her body tell her that calling the number on that card would change everything? Sage lasted exactly 18 hours before she called the number. She tried to focus on her normal routine, work, classes, her second job at the diner, but Antonio's words kept playing in her mind. Be careful who you trust. What did he know that she didn't? The breaking point came when she noticed the black SUV. It was parked across from the coffee shop when she arrived for her morning shift. The same one she'd seen 3 days ago, with the same impossible-to-read license plate. When she left for her afternoon classes, it was gone. When she walked to the diner for her evening shift, it was back, parked in a different location, but clearly following her route. By the time she got home to her tiny apartment, Sage's nerves were worn down. She double-checked her locks, closed her curtains, and sat on her bed, staring at Antonio's business card. Her hands shook as she dialed the number. He answered on the first ring. "I was wondering when you'd call." "There's a car following me," Sage said without introduction. "A black SUV." "I know," Antonio replied calmly. "They're mine." "Yours?" Sage's voice rose higher. "Why are you having me followed?" "Because 3 days ago, you saved my son's life," Antonio said simply, "and that makes you a target." The words hit Sage like a physical blow. "Your son?" "Marco is my son," Antonio confirmed. "And there are people in this city who would hurt him to get to me. Now that your face has been connected to his rescue, they might try to hurt you too." Sage sank onto her bed, her mind spinning. "I don't understand. Why would anyone want to hurt a little boy?" There was a long pause before Antonio answered. "Because of who I am." "And who are you?" Sage asked, though part of her already knew she didn't want to hear the answer. "Someone who makes enemies," Antonio said carefully. "Someone whose son shouldn't have been alone by that river in the first place." The weight of his words settled over Sage like a heavy blanket. She thought about the expensive suits, the black SUV, the way people had reacted to Marco's name at the hospital. She started, then stopped, unable to say the words. "Meet me tomorrow," Antonio said. "There's a restaurant called Benedetto's in Little Italy. 8 o'clock, I'll explain everything." "I don't think that's a good idea," Sage said quickly. "Sage." Antonio's voice was gentle but firm. "You're already involved whether you want to be or not. The question is whether you want to understand what you're involved in." After he hung up, Sage sat in her dark apartment for a long time, staring at her phone. Every rational part of her brain screamed that she should pack a bag and leave the city. But a larger part, the part that remembered a small boy's frightened eyes and the way Antonio had looked at her like she was something amazing, knew she was going to that restaurant. The next evening, Sage stood outside Benedetto's, wearing her only dress that wasn't from a thrift store. The restaurant was elegant in an old-world way, with warm lighting and the kind of atmosphere that whispered of family traditions and carefully guarded secrets. Antonio was waiting at a corner table, and when he stood to greet her, Sage was struck again by his commanding presence. Tonight he wore a dark suit that fit him perfectly, and his hair was styled in a way that made him look like he'd stepped out of a magazine. "You came," he said, pulling out her chair. "I almost didn't," Sage admitted as she sat down. "But you did. That tells me something about who you are." A waiter appeared immediately, as if he'd been waiting for some invisible signal. Antonio ordered wine in rapid Italian, his accent perfect and natural. "You speak Italian," Sage observed. "My family is from Sicily," Antonio explained. "4th generation, but we maintain the traditions." "What kind of traditions?" Sage asked, though she suspected she already knew. Antonio studied her face for a moment. "The kind that value loyalty above everything else. The kind that protect family at any cost." The wine arrived, and Antonio poured for both of them. Sage noticed how the waiter's hands shook slightly, how other diners glanced their way with expressions of recognition and fear. "Tell me about yourself," Antonio said, changing the subject. What do you do besides save drowning children? I work, Sage said simply. 2 jobs, night classes. I'm studying social work. Why social work? Sage hesitated, then decided honesty was her best defense. Because I grew up in foster care. I know what it's like to need someone who actually cares. Something shifted in Antonio's expression. No family? Not anymore, Sage said. My parents died when I was 8. Car accident. I aged out of the system at 18, and I've been on my own ever since. That explains it, Antonio murmured. Explains what? Why you didn't hesitate to jump in that river. You know what it's like to need saving. Their food arrived. Dishes Sage couldn't pronounce, but that tasted like heaven. As they ate, Antonio told her about Marco, about how his son had been born to a woman who couldn't handle the reality of Antonio's life. She left when Marco was 2, Antonio said quietly. Took nothing but her clothes and never looked back. Marco doesn't remember her. That must be hard, Sage said. Raising him alone. I have help, Antonio replied. But yes, it's hard. Especially when your life makes it dangerous for your child to exist. How did he end up at the river? Sage asked. Antonio's jaw tightened. Someone was supposed to be watching him. Someone who's no longer in my employ. The casual way he said it made Sage's blood run cold. What does that mean? It means Marco is the most important thing in my world, Antonio said, his voice carrying an edge of steel, and people who put him in danger learn very quickly not to make that mistake again. They finished dinner in relative silence, the weight of unspoken truths hanging between them. When Antonio walked her outside, Sage noticed the black SUV waiting at the curb. This is where I tell you to stay away from me, Antonio said as they stood on the sidewalk. This is where I explain that knowing me will only bring danger into your life. But, Sage prompted. But I can't, Antonio admitted. Because 3 days ago, you risked everything to save the most precious thing in my world. And because when I look at you, I see something I thought I'd never find. What's that? Sage whispered. Someone worth protecting, Antonio said simply. Before Sage could respond, he stepped closer. Close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. I'm going to ask you something, he said quietly. And I need you to think very carefully before you answer. Okay, Sage breathed. Would you like to meet Marco properly this time? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meanings Sage was only beginning to understand. Meeting his son would mean stepping fully into Antonio's world, accepting whatever dangers came with it. But when she thought about the little boy's frightened eyes, about the way he'd reached for her hand in the ambulance, her answer came without hesitation. Yes, she said. I'd like that very much. Antonio smiled then, the first real smile she'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. Tomorrow, he said, I'll pick you up after your morning shift. As the SUV pulled away, leaving Sage alone on the sidewalk, she realized she'd just crossed a line she could never uncross. Whatever Antonio Ricci was, whatever world she was stepping into, there was no going back now. And despite the fear running through her veins, she found she didn't want to. The mansion in the Hamptons was nothing like Sage had imagined. Instead of the cold, scary structure she'd expected, it was warm and inviting, with large windows that let in streams of golden afternoon light. Children's toys were scattered across the perfectly cut lawn, and she could hear the sound of laughter coming from somewhere behind the house. This is beautiful, Sage said as Antonio led her up the front steps. Marco chose it, Antonio replied. He said it looked like the house from his favorite movie. Before Sage could ask which movie, the front door burst open and a small figure came running out. Papa! Marco launched himself into Antonio's arms, talking excitedly in rapid Italian. Seeing them together, Sage felt something warm and unexpected bloom in her chest. The fearsome man she'd had dinner with last night was completely transformed in his son's presence, his face soft with unconditional love. Marco, Antonio said gently, switching to English, do you remember the lady who helped you at the river? Marco turned in his father's arms and studied Sage with serious dark eyes, eyes that were identical to Antonio's. Then his face broke into a brilliant smile. "The angel lady," he exclaimed, reaching for her. Sage's heart melted as the little boy wrapped his arms around her neck. "Hi, sweetheart. How are you feeling?" "Much better," Marco said seriously. "Papa says you saved my life." "You're a very brave boy," Sage told him. "You were so strong in the water." "I was scared," Marco admitted. "But then you came, and I wasn't scared anymore." Over Marco's head, Sage met Antonio's eyes. The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. He was looking at her like she was something amazing, something he'd never expected to find. "Come," Marco said, taking Sage's hand. "I want to show you my room." The next hour passed in a blur of toys, stories, and Marco's endless talking. The little boy was smart and charming, switching easily between English and Italian, and clearly loved by everyone in the house. "He likes you," Antonio observed as they watched Marco play in the garden from the terrace. "He's an amazing kid," Sage replied. "You should be proud." "I am," Antonio said simply. "But I'm also terrified every day that something will happen to him because of who I am." Sage turned to study his profile. "What exactly is it that you do, Antonio?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on his son. "My family has been in New York for 4 generations, he said finally. "We've built an empire that spans legitimate businesses and other interests." "Other interests," Sage repeated. "Import, export, real estate, construction," Antonio continued. "We employ thousands of people, support dozens of charities, and contribute millions to the city's economy." "But," Sage prompted. "But we also operate outside the law when necessary," Antonio admitted. "We settle disputes that the courts can't handle. We protect people who can't protect themselves. We maintain order in places where chaos would otherwise take over." The words were carefully chosen, diplomatic. But Sage understood what he wasn't saying. "You're the head of a crime family." "I'm the head of a family," Antonio corrected. "What others choose to call it is their business." A chill ran down Sage's spine as the full reality of the situation hit her. She was sitting in a mansion with one of the most dangerous men in New York, watching his son play in a garden that was probably surrounded by armed guards. "I should go," she said, starting to stand. Antonio's hand closed gently around her wrist. "Please don't." "Antonio, I can't. I'm not the kind of person who gets involved in this world." "What kind of person are you?" he asked quietly. "I'm nobody," Sage said, the words coming out more bitter than she'd intended. "I'm a barista who lives in a studio apartment and eats ramen for dinner. I don't belong here." "You're wrong," Antonio said firmly. "You're the kind of person who risks everything to save a stranger's child. You're the kind of person who works 3 jobs to put herself through school. You're the kind of person who makes my son smile for the first time in months." "Papa!" Marco called from the garden. "Come play with us." "Us?" Antonio raised an eyebrow. "Me and Angel Lady," Marco clarified. Despite everything, Sage found herself smiling. "Angel Lady?" "That's what he's been calling you," Antonio explained. "He told everyone at school that an angel jumped into the river to save him." The simple innocence of it made Sage's heart ache. She looked at Marco, who was waiting expectantly for them to join him, and felt her resolve fading. "One game," she said finally. "Then I really do need to go." But one game turned into dinner, which turned into bedtime stories, which turned into Sage falling asleep on the couch while Marco curled up beside her, his small hand holding hers. She woke to find a blanket draped over her and Antonio sitting in a nearby chair, watching them both with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What time is it?" she whispered, careful not to wake Marco. "Late," Antonio replied softly. "You missed your evening shift." Panic shot through Sage. "I have to go. I need that job." "It's taken care of," Antonio said calmly. "What do you mean, taken care of?" "I called the diner, told them you were sick. They said to take all the time you need." Sage stared at him. People don't just do things like that." "I do," Antonio said simply, "when it comes to protecting the people I care about." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Sage carefully pulled herself free from Marco's sleeping form and followed Antonio to the kitchen. "You can't protect me," she said once they were alone. "And you can't control my life." "I'm not trying to control your life," Antonio replied. "I'm trying to keep you alive." "From what?" "I saved your son." End of story. Why would anyone care about that? Antonio poured himself a glass of whiskey and offered one to Sage, who shook her head. "Because my enemies don't see it that way. They see a weakness. They see someone I might care about." "Do you?" Sage asked quietly. "Care about me?" Antonio set down his glass and moved closer. Close enough that she could see the tiredness in his eyes, the weight he carried every day. 3 days ago, I was a man who trusted no one outside my immediate family, he said quietly. I was a man who believed that caring about someone was the same as signing their death warrant. And now, Sage whispered, now I look at you and I see everything I thought I could never have, Antonio admitted. I see someone who makes my son laugh. Someone who risks everything for a stranger. Someone who makes me want to be better than what I am. Before Sage could respond, his phone buzzed. Antonio glanced at it, and his expression immediately darkened. What is it? Sage asked. We need to leave, Antonio said, his voice sharp with urgency. Now? But what's wrong? Someone just tried to break into your apartment, Antonio said grimly. And they left a message. The blood drained from Sage's face. What kind of message? Antonio's jaw tightened. The kind that means this just became a war. The ride back to Manhattan was tense and silent. Marco slept in his car seat between them, blissfully unaware of the danger surrounding his small world. Sage stared out the window at the city lights, her mind racing with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Tell me about the message, she said finally. Antonio's hands tightened on the steering wheel. They spray-painted a target on your door, along with a phone number. Whose number? Vincent Torino, Antonio said grimly. He's been trying to move in on my territory for months. This is his way of declaring war. Sage felt sick. Because I saved Marco? Because he sees you as leverage, Antonio corrected. He thinks hurting you will hurt me. Will it? Sage asked quietly. Antonio glanced at her, his dark eyes intense even in the dim light of the car. Yes. The simple honesty of his answer made Sage's breath catch. In just a few days, she'd somehow become important to this dangerous, complicated man. The thought should have terrified her, but instead she felt something warm and protective bloom in her chest. What happens now? She asked. Now you disappear, Antonio said firmly. I have a safe house upstate. You'll stay there until this is resolved. For how long? However long it takes. Sage shook her head. I can't just disappear, Antonio. I have jobs, classes, responsibilities. You have a life, Antonio said quietly. And I intend to make sure you keep it. They pulled up to Sage's building, and she could see the damage immediately. Her apartment door was covered in red paint, the target symbol crude but clear. Police cars lined the street, their lights casting eerie shadows on the surrounding buildings. Stay in the car, Antonio instructed. But Sage was already opening her door. It's my apartment, she said firmly. I'm not hiding in the car. Antonio caught her arm gently. Sage, these people don't play games. If they're willing to do this in public, they're willing to do much worse in private. Then teach me to protect myself, Sage said, surprising them both with her determination. Don't just hide me away like I'm helpless. Something shifted in Antonio's expression. You want to learn? I want to survive, Sage corrected. And I want to make sure Marco stays safe. Antonio studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. But we do this my way. The next few hours were a blur of police reports, insurance claims, and security arrangements. Sage's landlord was apologetic but firm. She couldn't stay in the building until the situation was resolved. Her few possessions fit easily into 2 suitcases, a reminder of how little she'd collected in her 25 years. Where will you go? The police officer asked as he finished his report. She's staying with family, Antonio answered smoothly before Sage could speak. After the police left, Antonio helped her load her belongings into his car. Marco had woken up and was asking questions in rapid Italian, his young mind trying to process the chaos around him. "Is Angel Lady coming to live with us?" he asked hopefully. "For a while," Antonio replied carefully. "Would you like that?" "Yes," Marco exclaimed. "She can read me stories and make pancakes and—" "Slow down, Piccolo," Antonio laughed, messing up his son's hair. "Let's see how she feels about pancakes first." Despite everything, Sage found herself smiling. "I make excellent pancakes." "See, Papa?" Marco said triumphantly. "I told you she was perfect." Over Marco's head, Sage met Antonio's eyes again. The word perfect hung between them, loaded with possibilities and promises neither of them was quite ready to voice. The safe house turned out to be a penthouse apartment in Midtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows and security that would make the Secret Service jealous. It was beautiful, luxurious, and felt like a very expensive prison. "This is temporary," Antonio assured her as he showed her to the guest room. "Just until we neutralize the threat." "How do you neutralize someone like Vincent Torino?" Sage asked. Antonio's expression darkened. "You let me worry about that." Over the next week, Sage's life transformed completely. Her days were spent with Marco, reading stories, playing games, helping with homework, while her evenings were dedicated to learning skills she'd never imagined needing. Antonio taught her to shoot, to fight, to recognize danger signs and escape routes. "You're a natural," he said after she hit the center of the target for the 5th time in a row. "I had good motivation to learn," Sage replied, thinking of Marco's innocent smile. "Is that the only motivation?" Antonio asked quietly. Sage lowered the gun and turned to face him. They were alone in the penthouse's private gym, the city sprawling out below them through the massive windows. Antonio had removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, and Sage could see the edge of a tattoo peeking out from beneath his shirt. "No," she admitted. "It's not." Antonio moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "What else motivates you, Sage?" "You," she whispered. "This family you've built. The way Marco looks at you like you hung the moon. The way you look at me like I'm something precious." "You are something precious," Antonio said firmly. "You're the most precious thing that's ever walked into my life." Before Sage could respond, his phone buzzed with an urgent message. Antonio glanced at it, and his expression immediately shifted to something cold and dangerous. "What is it?" Sage asked. "Vincent made a mistake," Antonio said grimly. "He went after one of my legitimate businesses. Hurt innocent people." "What does that mean?" Antonio holstered his gun and reached for his jacket. "It means this ends tonight." "Antonio, wait." He turned back to her, his face set in hard lines. "I need you to promise me something." "What?" "If something happens to me, you'll take care of Marco. You'll make sure he grows up knowing he was loved." The words hit Sage like a physical blow. "Nothing's going to happen to you." "Promise me," Antonio insisted. "Promise me," Sage whispered. "But I also promise that you're coming back to us." Antonio cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the violence he was about to commit. "I love you," he said simply. "I know it's too soon. I know this is crazy, but I need you to know that." "I love you too," Sage replied without hesitation. "So you better come home." Antonio kissed her then, soft and desperate and full of promises. When he pulled away, his eyes were bright with tears he wouldn't let fall. "Take care of my son," he said. "Take care of yourself," Sage replied. "We'll be waiting." After he left, Sage sat with Marco as he slept, her hand resting protectively on his small back. Outside, the city continued its restless dance, unaware that somewhere in its depths, a war was being fought for the right to love and be loved. Hours later, as dawn broke over Manhattan, Antonio's key turned in the lock. Sage ran to him, not caring about the blood on his clothes or the exhaustion in his eyes. She only cared that he was alive, that he was home. "It's over," he said simply, pulling her into his arms. "Vincent won't be bothering anyone ever again." "What happened?" "He made a choice," Antonio replied. "The wrong one." You're safe now. Marco's safe. Sage buried her face in his chest, breathing in his familiar scent. What happens now? Now, Antonio said, his voice soft with wonder, we figure out how to be a family. 2 years later, Sage stood in the kitchen of their Hamptons home, watching through the window as Antonio taught Marco to ride a bicycle. The little boy's laughter carried on the summer breeze, pure and joyful and free. She'd finished her social work degree the previous spring, graduating summa cum laude, with Antonio and Marco cheering from the audience. Now she worked with at-risk youth in the city, using her own experiences to help kids who needed someone to believe in them. Mama, look! Marco called, pedaling furiously across the lawn. I'm doing it! The word mama still made Sage's heart skip a beat. Marco had started using it 6 months ago, casually and naturally, as if she'd always been his mother. Antonio had cried the first time he heard it, though he tried to hide his tears. I see you, sweetheart, Sage called back. You're amazing. Antonio jogged over to the window, his face flushed with pride and exercise. Did you see that? He's a natural. Just like his father, Sage said, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from Antonio's forehead. His father, who's madly in love with his mother, Antonio murmured, pulling her close. His mother, who's planning to say yes when his father finally gets around to proposing, Sage replied with a smile. Antonio's eyes widened. How did you? The ring box in your sock drawer isn't exactly well hidden, Sage laughed. Also, Marco may have mentioned something about helping you pick out the prettiest ring for Mama. That kid can't keep a secret to save his life, Antonio groaned. Good thing I love surprises that aren't actually surprises, Sage said, standing on her toes to kiss him. As they stood there in their kitchen, watching their son play in the garden of their home, Sage marveled at how much her life had changed. 2 years ago, she'd been a struggling barista with no family and no future. Now she was part of something bigger than herself, something worth fighting for. Do you ever regret it? Antonio asked quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Jumping into that river? Sage looked at him, this dangerous, complicated, wonderful man who'd turned her world upside down, and then at Marco, who was now attempting to ride with no hands. Never, she said firmly. Best decision I ever made. Even though it brought you into my world? Especially because it brought me into your world, Sage corrected. You and Marco, you're my family, my choice, my heart. Antonio kissed her forehead, his arms tightening around her. Ti amo, mia. I love you too, Sage whispered back. Outside, Marco had abandoned his bicycle and was now chasing butterflies through the garden, his laughter echoing across the lawn. Soon he would come inside for lunch, talking about his morning adventures and planning his afternoon activities. Tonight they would have dinner together as a family, and Antonio would probably try to work up the courage to propose properly. But for now, Sage was content to stand in her kitchen, wrapped in the arms of the man she loved, watching their son play in the safety of their home. She'd learned that family wasn't about blood or biology. It was about choice, about showing up, about loving someone enough to dive into dark water to save them. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, they loved you enough to dive in and save you right back. This story has come to an end. If it touched your heart in any way, leave your like and share it with someone who also enjoys emotional stories. New stories are coming soon. Until next time.